afraid of the dark.
After being tormented to the point of a mental breakdown, the Sherman family had nowhere to turn. They were stuck on a property haunted by something beyond their understanding, and to make matters worse, they faced financial ruin. Fortunately, someone heard their cry for help. After enduring a harrowing ordeal that pushed them to the brink of mental breakdown, the Sherman family found themselves with nowhere to turn for help. They were stuck on a property that played host to something beyond their comprehension, and to make matters worse, they were also facing financial ruin. Fortunately, someone heard their desperate plea. In March 1996, around the same time the Sherman family was preparing to leave their ranch, billionaire developer Robert Bigelow was in the process of establishing an organization that would later become known as the National Institute for Discovery Science (NIDS). This ambitious, unprecedented, and well-funded entity comprised a team of highly qualified scientists equipped with state-of-the-art technology. The team could be deployed anywhere in the country at a moment's notice to investigate highly unusual occurrences. Never before had a scientific organization received such substantial funding to systematically examine and study paranormal and supernatural phenomena. These specialists were no dropouts. They held doctoral degrees in various fields ranging from biochemistry and psychology to astrophysics and veterinary medicine. Bigelow meticulously handpicked the team members, favoring candidates with a skeptical mindset who would always seek rational explanations first and foremost, leaving pseudoscience at the door. Additionally, Bigelow assembled a world-class advisory board whose members were selected from a diverse range of disciplines. This group was tasked with evaluating the evidence gathered by the field team. In total, NIDS boasted a roster of over 25 members, most of whom were drawn from the scientific community, along with a few hired security personnel from military backgrounds. Two of the most prominent members of the scientific contingent were physicists Eric Davis and Colonel John B. Alexander, a biochemist. Alexander went on to document the experiences of the Sherman family and NIDS in his book Reality Denied: First-Hand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen, a collaboration with journalist and author George Knapp. Not long after its inception, NIDS caught wind of media reports regarding a small ranch in northern Utah that seemed to be a frequent target of UFO sightings. Terry Sherman, the patriarch of the Sherman family, reluctantly reached out to the local newspaper early in the year, sharing accounts of bizarre occurrences on his property almost as a cry for help. He had long suspected that much of the activity was somehow linked to secret military technology. Neither a believer in extraterrestrials nor a proponent of folklore, he hoped that by drawing attention to the phenomenon, whoever was behind it might back off. In the summer of 1996, Bigelow convened a meeting to discuss this intriguing case. In many respects, the ranch presented a tantalizing opportunity for a field laboratory, secluded from prying eyes, where a wide range of phenomena could be studied on a regular basis. This prospect seemed too good to pass up. Within weeks of meeting with the Sherman family and hearing their incredible stories, the NIDS team expressed interest in purchasing the property. Gwen and the children were desperate to move on and never look back, but Terry, a proud man, was reluctant to leave. He was furious about being driven off his own land, especially since he still had no clue what was behind the strange occurrences. However, he had to consider what was best for his family and reluctantly agreed to the sale, offering to stay on as the ranch manager for the NIDS team. He wanted to witness the progress of the investigation and see what answers they might uncover, perhaps bringing some closure to the ordeal his family had endured for the past 2 years. Given that the NIDS team was accustomed to working in controlled laboratory settings and had little experience managing a ranch, they readily accepted Terry's proposal. Along with the property, they also acquired the livestock, intending to use them as bait. Terry also kept some of his own cattle on the ranch for the same purpose. By September of that year, the NIDS team had moved their surveillance trailer and mobile laboratory onto the premises. The field team consisted of 4 scientists and a group of assistants who maintained a constant, round-the-clock presence on the ranch. Their role was to gather and analyze evidence, which would then be presented to the advisory board during monthly meetings. The first order of business for the team upon their arrival was to conduct a series of tests to investigate the phenomena described by the Sherman family. The events reported by the Shermans were too varied and bizarre to be explained by any single hypothesis. The team's initial thoughts revolved around possible psychological or ecological factors. They considered the possibility that Terry was fabricating stories for attention, or that he and his family were suffering from mass delusions. They also explored the potential presence of hallucinogenic plant species on the land, contamination of the family's water supply, intense electromagnetic fields, infrasound, tectonic stress, and the existence of fault lines that could induce light anomalies and visual hallucinations. The short answer to all these inquiries was a resounding no. Despite this, aside from a few strange lights in the sky, the remainder of 1996 passed without incident. The NIDS field team, initially skeptical of some of the more outlandish tales they had heard, would soon have their doubts challenged as they continued their work on the ranch. The longer they stayed, the more they became convinced that the Sherman family had been telling the truth. On March 9th, 1997, Terry and Gwen discovered the carcass of a black Angus calf on the grass just over 100 yards from the homestead. Gwen Selden had rarely visited the ranch since the family had left, but that day she was helping Terry retrieve some animals from the pasture. They tagged a calf and then walked 300 yards across the field to tag others that were grazing to the south. The dog that was with them began to growl. Her hair stood up on end as she looked back at the ranch house. Terry and Gwen followed her gaze and saw that the mother calf was limping back and forth, clearly out of her mind. When they ran over to see what was going on, they found the calf on the ground. The entire abdomen, including all the organs, had been removed. The only things left were the head, legs, and spine. Parts of the rib cage remained intact, and also missing was the ear, which looked like it had been cut off with a sharp instrument. What was most puzzling was that there was not a drop of blood on the grass around the animal. The severed ear was the one they had noted less than 45 minutes ago. In that time, something had removed over 60 pounds of meat from this poor animal in broad daylight and in full view of the rancher and his wife. Although they saw and heard nothing, the NIDS vet was baffled. The cuts were clean and precise, with no blood spilled. He suggested that no predator he knew could have been responsible. When asked if they noticed anything unusual before the incident, both Terry and Gwen reported sensing a strong musky smell in the area. After the veterinarian took samples from the calf's autopsy, the rest of the team began searching for traces. They accidentally walked past one of the kennels and saw that all the dogs were huddled inside. NIDS had strategically placed 3 large watchtowers on the property, each surrounded by a mesh fence, within which several dogs were kept. The dogs had a supernatural ability to sense when something strange was about to happen. Terry noticed that the dogs hadn't gone outside all day. They refused to leave their shelter for many days after this event. Slowly but surely, the NIDS team began to understand why. Something was hiding on the ranch. Around 11 p.m. on March 12th, the dogs started howling and barking at something on the far side of the pasture. Terry and the NIDS team were sitting in the observation trailer but soon loaded into a truck and headed towards the commotion. A bright spotlight was mounted on the roof of the SUV, and as they turned the corner, the beam of light washed over the distant poplars. At that moment, they saw a pair of yellow eyes sitting about 20 feet high in one of the trees. It was a pair of huge eyes reflecting the light. Terry stopped the truck and reached for his rifle. Getting out of the vehicle, he leaned on the open door and aimed through the scope. He saw the outline of a huge creature sitting in the tree. "I won't let it take another calf," he growled. The creature didn't move, it just sat there, staring straight at him. The moment the rifle shot rang out across the open pasture, the creature's eyes blinked and went out. There was a loud thud as something fell from the branches. Terry got back in the truck and drove towards the poplar. Stopping about 40 feet from the tree, he found no signs of the creature. Everything was quiet. Terry and the NIDS investigators spread out and entered the woods. They were about 5 yards apart when Terry's shout rang out, "I see it." 2 more loud shots were fired. When the NIDS crew reached him, they heard a noise in the branches ahead as something heavy crashed through the underbrush, moving away from them. The creature was gone. Terry described it as a huge dog, but bipedal. After an hour of searching in the dark, the team found only 2 large tracks, spaced 20 feet apart. Each track was 14 inches long and had huge claw indentations. The rest of the month passed without further incidents, but the dogs and livestock continued to behave strangely. They were on edge and appeared frightened, as if they sensed a predator in the area. On April 1st, another cow disappeared without a trace. No blood or tracks were found. 1 minute it was there, the next it was gone. One of the strangest and most well-known events occurred that same day and involved Terry's 4 most valuable Angus bulls, which he had temporarily brought back to the property for convenience. Gwen joined him again to help with some tasks. They were driving from the east side of the ranch to the west, and as they passed the homestead, they glanced at the nearest pen and saw 4 black Angus bulls staring back at them. Each bull was worth thousands of dollars. Gwen remarked to Terry how devastated she would be if anything happened to them. In the western part of the ranch, they fixed a broken fence line and tagged a couple of newborn calves. These tasks took them no more than an hour. On the way back, they rounded a bend in the road heading towards the homestead, and their hearts suddenly pounded in unison. The 4 black Angus bulls were no longer in the pen. Terry panicked, jumped out of the truck, and ran to the enclosure. The gate was still locked, but the bulls were nowhere in sight. He couldn't believe his eyes. Next to the pen was an old trailer that hadn't been used in years. Terry happened to look into one of the windows and, to his utter astonishment, saw all 4 bulls silently standing crammed into the tiny space. They seemed to be in some kind of trance. "They're here," he shouted to his wife. At this, the bulls snapped out of their hypnotic state. They suddenly realized where they were and began to panic, wildly kicking and thrashing in the cramped trailer. Eventually, one of the back doors was knocked off, and all 4 bulls tumbled into the sunlight. It took Terry and his wife 2 hours to gently coax them back into the pen. When the NIDS team examined the trailer, they did so in a state of mild disbelief. It would have taken hours to get even one of those enraged bulls into such a confined space, let alone 4. The idea of 4 bulls sharing such a small trailer seemed absurd. The only entry into the trailer from the pen was through a door that was closed off with wire. The NIDS team found old cobwebs strewn across the inner door panel and frame, indicating that this entry hadn't been opened in a long time. This was puzzling, as there was no other way for the bulls to have entered the trailer from the pen. Further investigation revealed that the bars of the pen had somehow become heavily magnetized, an anomaly that dissipated over time. This prompted the NIDS team to scan the magnetic fields across the entire property. Sometime later that same month, Calm Keller was investigating strange tracks found on the south side of the ranch when he was enveloped by an unbearable musky smell. It was a strange odor. Having been on the property for several months, he was accustomed to the various scents of the fauna and wildlife. But this was different. About 50 yards away, he could see his teammate making his way through the Russian olives, but he couldn't explain the strange smell with anything familiar. Suddenly, the hair on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine. Something was nearby. He couldn't see it, but he felt its presence. It was watching him. Trying to stay calm, he clenched his teeth and continued his task. Gradually, the feeling subsided and the musky smell receded. When he spoke to his teammate an hour later, the teammate also reported feeling watched and catching a whiff of the strange odor. He also mentioned that his field compass had malfunctioned, pointing in the direction where the smell was strongest, only returning to normal once the smell dissipated. These magnetic interferences were the first vague pattern the investigators had observed throughout the year. Even stranger events were to follow, eliminating any doubts the NIDS team had about the oddities occurring on the ranch.